Hello and welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. Today we close out the introductory overview that we've had for the book of Acts. Uh, the next session we will start in the chapter and verse individual study of each chapter in the book. As we have learned to date, in our introduction, the author of Acts is presumed to be Luke, or whomever authored the Gospel of Luke, also authored Acts. However, the author did not title the manuscript of Acts. Western Christians have long referred to Acts in the Latin words that would be translated Acts of the Apostles. However, but scholars argue such a name does not fit the content, as this book is mainly about Peter and Paul, with the works of the other apostles ignored, plus the fact that Paul was not one of the original apostles or not considered an official apostle by many. Some scholars note that the author's storyline shifts between Luke's gospel, which was written first, into Acts with a change in the focus from Jesus' presence to the Holy Spirit's arrival and influence on the works of Christ's followers. Why might that be? Could be part explained maybe in that this writing is occurring later than Jesus' presence by 4 to 6 decades. Thus, the storyline in Acts will move quickly out of Jesus' Judea, which was where the book of Luke is centered, to a wider geographic area in the Gentile country, often populated with diaspora Jews, however. The attempt to establish Christ followers and churches then in these Gentile areas essentially is the story of Acts. Dr. Philip Carey, he's professor of religion and philosophy at Eastern University in Pennsylvania, teaches that we must appreciate the large diversity of early Christian theologies that emerge. Acts is covering essentially one of those and is staking out the position against the others and Judaism. A central issue in this is this Christian belief is to separate it from its Jewish roots. After all, Christianity, as we know it, evolved in Judaism. It was well established as a sect of Judaism and then took itself a good while to separate out. Part of that separation, of course, was occurring in the Roman Jewish war that resulted in the destruction of the temple, Second Temple in 70 AD. And then the history reports the final removal, anyway, which probably triggered the Gospel of John somewhere around early 90s AD, in which they no longer had the Christian believers, or maybe better to call them believers in Christ as the Messiah, were for all practical purposes kicked out of the synagogues, lost their exemption, and therefore were on their own. There were Jews that accepted Jesus as a Son of God, and some of them accepted him also as the Messiah. In addition, the rabbinic Judaism that was developing post 70 AD was emerging, and it conflicted significantly with the evolution of Christianity. So the Christians continued to live as Jews There were a fair number of them. They observed the Mosaic law, but retained elements of Christianity for a long time. We see good evidence. It's still a significant version there in the 5th century. But this element of Christianity that's going to be described here in Acts is separating away from that. Also buried in Acts narrative is the peril of trying to establish loyalty of Jesus Christ as Lord in a Roman Empire that demands loyalty to the Roman Emperor as Lord and God. Some scholars report that inferred in Acts is indications that these theologies competed, that is, these Jewish theologies, various forms of Judaism, and the emerging variations in Christianity are competing. And what we'll find in Acts is Peter and Paul's version. What is in Acts reportedly is probably Peter's version as modified by Paul and his followers. Thus, Acts is implying that the book of Acts is the reliable source of that version of Christianity. But outside sources clearly demonstrate that other apostles did not necessarily go along with this. They had their own variations of Christianity. Some suggest that may be why these other apostles are not listed. So this is a story in Acts of Peter and Paul's version of Christianity. Several scholars urge readers to refresh their knowledge of the cultural context also of the time and place before studying Acts. It is different from the Gospels and letters. The context is taking on a larger area. Acts covers much of this larger geographic area than was in the Gospels. The letters were earlier than the Gospels, actually. That is, the letters of Paul, and were mostly written to a single congregation. In contrast, Acts is aimed at the whole Roman Empire and beyond, notes Dr. Matthew Skinner of Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. He teaches we should note in the first 7 chapters of Acts that the action is in Jerusalem area, Judea proper, or very nearby. So a pressing issue is how Jesus could be the Messiah or Christ, and how that conviction fits within the long-standing Jewish hope of a Messiah. In later chapters, Acts encounters other Jews in other areas. The Gentiles that are in these other areas are being converted, but they revere a wide range of deities, not just one deity. I mean, not just talking about one particular group will have one deity, that group will have many deities. And then the next group will have a different set of deities and so forth. And this diversity creates significant issues that the church, that Paul and the missionaries have to address. We must appreciate that the Jewish communities were present in nearly every single city in Asia Minor at that time. And they are there. Some of them are going to become converts, and others are going to become obstacles to the movement. And after all, these Jewish communities were also not uniform in their belief, because Judaism was making major shifts after the temple was gone to what we refer to today as rabbinic Judaism. Gentile populations were very diverse in their cultural mores, also devotion to their various little g gods, devotion to Rome and to the emperor. Some evidence supports that Jews initially accepted Jesus as the Messiah, but abandoned that idea the longer time went without his returning. Moreover, the church had more strongly adopted positions against accepting the Mosaic law, circumcision, the seventh-day Sabbath, the Jewish holy days, and so forth. They just simply were no longer being mandated, although some of these Christian groups are going to continue to observe them, but they're not being mandated. Thus, there becomes stronger and stronger pushback against Judaism, and so we see this so-called Jewish Christian groups interfering or debating with them. In other words, there's problems there with trying to sort this all out and come out with a version of Christianity. And the Jewish people who are believing that Jesus is the Messiah don't want to abandon their long religious past as well. So the storyline moves out of Judea into deeper and deeper Roman territory in Asia Minor. Thus, Dr. Carl Holliday teaches that Luke in Acts portrays the church not only as harmless to Roman society, but also beneficial. The pagan society of Roman colonies were often deeply steeped in magic worship. Rome clearly was very much against such worship. So the church is likely gaining some favor with Rome and Roman citizens by being squarely against magic and soothsaying and so forth. Acts' message also likely plays well to the deeply embedded Hellenistic notions of the communities. Paul especially teaches his churches that Christians can be a good Roman citizen and are expected to be a good Roman citizen by the faith itself, except for they're not to worship the emperor as a god. Some suggest this would likely have increased in importance once Christians were expelled from the Jewish synagogues and lost their religious exemption or worship. The only restriction that Christianity had relative to that was be a good Roman citizen. You just cannot consider the emperor divine. Generosity in the community towards the benefit of the community as a whole was a central Christian teaching of Jesus. Paul does not quote Jesus very often, but when he does, it often relates to extolling this spontaneous generosity towards that Christ taught towards people in need for the good of the whole. Acts portrays the church in full accord with Jesus relative to that point in particular. Scholars note another likely strong point with Rome would have been its support of the subordinate master relationship, be that in a slavery situation versus being at all levels. In other words, the head of the house was the husband, and so forth, and all else were to submit, as was the social requirement in the Roman system. So the church is not against that. It's going right along with it. Also, the church educated its believers towards a standard set of beliefs, and this history reports this was considered a very valuable aspect. They were taught to be disciples to the faith, and that would have fit well in a Hellenistic, Roman, and Jewish culture, which all three had the same idea, all of which demanded such educations and discipline in the system. As one scholar notes, Christianity was not supportive of just believing and acting any way you want to believe. No, there was a set of beliefs. The Church of Acts in no way wanted those outsiders to view the church as its members being uneducated, untrained people without discipline, without culture, and unable to control human desires and will. Christians, like Jews, reject idolatry. Consequently, Gentile converts clearly had a major hurdle to cross when they came into the religion. They had to reject their many gods. Thus, the missionaries of Acts must make this clear and convincing without closing the ear towards Rome or influence towards Rome. They seem to do this by portraying the God they worship as the same God as the Jews worship, and that God does not direct Christians to rebel against Roman authority, only teaches them that there are no other gods except the one high God, and it's the same one as Judaism has. As the church begins to drift towards the ideas of a Trinity concept, Christianity is also becoming more intolerant of Jewish concepts. Note several scholars. There is nothing in the three synoptic gospels that could not be tolerated in the variations or some variation of Judaism that existed at the time. Notes several Jewish scholars actually. But John's gospel teaches that Jesus is divine, and such would have crossed the line in Judaism. Acts and John were likely penned about the same time in church evolution. Thus, with John and Acts, the church is becoming more radical towards Judaism. A key theology in Acts is rooted in the concept that Gentiles can become God's chosen without adopting Jewish culture, Jewish worship, Jewish beliefs, and so forth. But the Gentile must abandon idolatry. Acts reflects that Jesus' ministry continues after his death and resurrection and ascension in the Christian faith and church, notes Dr. Holliday. The good news and healing ministries of Jesus continues in Christian ministry. Back in Luke's gospel, Jesus commissioned the 12 disciples to travel throughout the villages, bringing that good news and curing diseases and so forth. At that point, they are going out as Jesus' emissaries, and apostle is the Greek word for emissary, that is, one sent in your name. Acts is part of these emissaries' work, but not all of their works are mentioned. This happens to be the version that survived and was canoned. So hopefully this gives you some introductory overview of what we're going to encounter in our slow trip through Acts as we bring in a number of scholars to help us interpret these scriptures as we go through them chapter and verse, starting in our next lesson. Have a good Bible study.